swirly thing is going on, and we are live. Hello, everyone, and what the hell is up with pain and itch? Uh, Pretty excited about this because we've all dealt with pain, we've all dealt with itch. They're kind of a combination of just they're awful, right? It's such an innate human response to just want to avoid anything itchy, anything painful. And I hadn't really ever considered, are these different things? Are they on the same spectrum of feelings? Is it always bad? Is it useful? There's so many questions, and a lot of you have sent them in. But thank you for coming to Ask Me. I'm a scientist. My name is Susanna Harris, and we're here every episode to bring on experts and basically ask your questions. You can send them in on social media, or you can stop by live. Everything is unrecorded, unscripted, and unedited, clearly unprofessional. But we're going to jump right in. Very excited to introduce today's guest, Jeremy Delahanty, who is a junior specialist at the IDEA Lab at UC Davis, but currently working remotely in SoCal thanks to the whole pandemic situation. But Jeremy has a really cool past in terms of his previous research, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But instead of me trying to explain it, let's go over and actually meet Jeremy. Hey, Jeremy, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Excited to be here. It's pretty neat getting to talk to you about this. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I think we started talking about this because we just had a general chat a little while back, and we started talking and realized like, oh, I need to have you on here because I have so many questions and figured maybe other people could learn from it. But anyway, so you're in a different field right now doing imaging and things like that. But in terms of itch and pain, not what is your background in itch and pain, but what's your background in itch and pain research?
When I started in undergrad at UC Davis in 2012, I was lucky enough to join the lab of Professor Earl Karstens, who is a itch world leading researcher. He's pretty awesome. And I basically started in his lab, and I worked in a couple other labs that working in preclinical itch and pain science. So trying to figure out how it is that we go from some stimulus that's painful or itchy, and it can turn into both, basically from the smallest stimulus level of some chemical compound or some physical interaction, all the way into how the brain processes it at like the neural coding level. And that's the main kind of stuff that I was able to work on throughout my undergrad experience, which was pretty exciting.
That's awesome. I like that you're like, that's sort of the main concept, but you just described something incredibly complex. So I'd love to dig in a little bit
Yeah.
more, just on like the physical chemical side. Let's use an example of like, what if I step on a Lego? Like what happens there? What is
Yeah.
the sequence of events?
So stepping on a Lego is one of the worst things that's happened to anybody because of how horribly painful that can be.
Really?
So I think it might be helpful to first preface that a lot of people think of pain as essentially essentially the physical process that's happening where you feel something hurts,
Hmm.
but the reality is that pain perception, at least defined scientifically, essentially it talks about both the physical communication of pain
Hmm.
or some harmful stimulus through the body and the emotional experience of something. So it's
Hmm.
possible for something to, like stepping on a Lego, to incite something called nociception without turning into something that's full-blown pain
So
as an
nociception is
emotional
that kind of
experience.
like, that's the feeling, right? The nociception is just like, okay, that's painful, right? Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. So it's sort of confusing. So nociception as a topic is essentially the means by which your body can communicate that something harmful is happening or could happen to you. The process of going from the receptors to your brain is the process of nociception.
Huh. Okay.
Whereas the experience of pain scientifically is considered as both the combination of something that is, well, not necessarily. So pain doesn't always have to have a physical component,
Hmm.
because of we describe painful things that have entirely mental processes
Right.
and things that pain is a very confusing
Yeah.
experience, both in terms of like our philosophy and just how we experience things generally, but scientifically it gets kind of caught up in how we talk about just painful things generally,
Yeah.
that it's important to separate out the process by which something like touching a hot stove or stepping on a Lego causes nociception, and how that is different than pain itself.
Huh. Yeah, I guess that makes sense because I read, I live on Twitter, as you know, and I read somebody's tweet the other day where they said that one of their earliest childhood experiences is that they thought their physics teacher said horses, and so they said, "Yeah, I love horses" in front of a whole class, and they meant forces. And I had that cringe feeling, and I think everyone's had that moment where you think back to something and you're like, "Oh gosh, bury me into the earth," and
Yeah.
that can actually be painful, but it's not. I haven't, actually hurt myself, so it makes sense, that experience of pain is not necessarily tied to physical touch.
Right.
Huh.
And in my experience in the labs that I've worked in, which were predominantly preclinical work, so using animal models, uh, I mostly, since it's very hard to ask how an animal is experiencing things emotionally and we can't directly communicate with them, I principally worked with things that would basically be a nociception to what we would classify as a painful response uh, in an animal model. So um, there's a lot of, and that's a whole another conversation,
Yeah.
but
Okay, cool. So we got there's these different things going on, where maybe there's a nociception of having the physical input, and then there's the brain, the kind of coding that happens on in there, which is, it seems like that's sort of our brain interpreting what happens a little bit instead of just sensing it. Is that about right?
yeah, so the essentially what happens is when something that starts a nociceptive response, or like when a nociceptive or noxious is the commonly used term, stimulus is applied to some part of your body, or to, like, say for example your skin. Uh, could you repeat the question actually? Sorry.
Sure. No, no, no. It's actually tricky because our audience can see both of us, but you can't see me at all. So the question being, like, when it does get up into our brain, this is sort of our brain interpreting things, doing that coding,
Yeah,
trying to figure out, like, adding labels to things.
yeah,
Okay.
right. So the something that's interesting about that is there are places that have been implicated in the brain that are supposed to process pain information or nociceptive information,
Okay.
but it doesn't appear that, at least as far as I'm aware, that there is a single center
Hmm.
that is like the pain processing center.
Right.
Uh, because pain is such a complicated experience that involves so many different neural circuits and different, I guess, perceptions of various things, uh, it's been pretty hard to say that there is a predominant pain center that is essentially the most important place
Hmm.
of pain perception. And at least we haven't really found that exact spot yet.
It's so fascinating, and I guess it makes sense because, and we're gonna hop into itch here because that's what I'm so excited about. But turning into the itch side, there's definitely times where if you have, I just think about having a bug bite and the itchiness will drive me like just out of it. And oftentimes I'll do the trick where I do the, like, make a little X with your fingernail and it
Mm-hmm.
hurts. And it makes it feel less itchy. I think, I don't know why that's happening. Maybe but like, in that case, the pain is actually like a welcome response. That's not like I didn't make it worse feeling. It's actually kind of providing a bit of relief. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, let's transition over there. Uh, we've talked a little bit about the pain side. How is itch different? Is it on that reception side? Is it on the interpretation side? Why is it awful? so um, yeah.
So the something that's kind of crazy about itch science in general is that it's actually only been relatively recent in terms of at least scientific scales within the past couple decades that itch has been considered its own special modality of sensation. So
Hmm.
like temperature or vision is a sensory modality. Itch for a long time, all the way back to when people were first investigating this, was considered to be kind of a subset of a painful
Okay.
experience. So it used to be thought, or one of the first theories about it was something involving an idea called intensity coding.
Huh.
And what that essentially means is the perception that you'd have is changing based off of how strong the stimulus is.
Mm-hmm.
So if it was something that was lightly painful, it would invoke an itch response. If something was really painful, it would feel like pain.
Okay.
That's how people used to think about it. But we have a few much more developed ideas of what's happening now. So it might help to first say that a common idea in neuroscience is of the principle of something called labeled line coding. What that essentially means is that there are certain receptors, so say like touch receptors, that only communicate information about touch. So like when you step on a Lego, for example, you have special nociceptors that will communicate only the fact that there's this intense pressure on your foot. And that's all they know how to talk about, and that's all they do talk about. Itch, on the other hand, which you can invoke itchiness from a whole variety of ways, whether it be a bug bite or something kind of gently brushing along your skin that feels funny and
This
it
whole
causes you to
conversation
scratch.
is so uncomfortable for me. I'm loving it, but I'm like thinking about being itchy and yeah,
Yeah,
going back to that.
it's a common thing
Yeah.
that there's actually an idea of something called contagious itch
Oh,
that has been pretty well documented where, especially working in the itch lab, whenever someone, like just as an anecdotal example,
yeah.
someone new would come to the lab and start seeing what we're up to,
Mhm.
and you definitely notice that they're sitting there scratching themselves a lot more, and
Yeah.
they probably don't even realize it sometimes. But
Yeah.
that's something that's being really actively investigated, actually, is social itching.
Social itching.
Um,
Okay, sorry.
yeah,
I totally sidetracked us there. But anyway, you were saying
that's
itch
okay.
might be the nociceptors being like, oh, there's a pressure, and but there's other things going on.
Yeah, so it turns out that there are actually itch specific. Well, that there's itch responsive uh, receptors or neurons called pruriceptors. PRU is how you start that, pruriceptors.
Hmm.
And there are actually multiple ways of inducing itch, like I mentioned before. You can have like a mechanically induced itch, but chemically there's histamine induced itch, which is probably the most common one that most of us experience.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so for your bug bite example, when a mosquito bites your arm and you start getting that little welt that shows up, you're having an active histamine response as an immune reaction to that region. It turns out that there are specific kinds of cells that are in your skin that will detect that histamine response, and that will bring about the sensation of feeling itchy and drive you to scratch at it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so there are specific itch type neurons, but what's weird about them is that they also respond to things that are typically painful at the same time. So they respond to both. At least chemically they do.
Interesting.
Which is sort of strange. So that sort of goes against the idea of labeled line coding that I brought up earlier, where like a touch neuron will only bring up touch information to your brain. These itch neurons seem to be able to communicate multiple kinds of information, and somehow along our spinal process into our brain, and the brain itself is able to determine, am I really itchy or is this really a painful experience? And one thing that actually ties into your example of drawing the little X in your skin is that it's been documented that pain actually specifically inhibits itch feelings
Whoa.
at the neural level. So that common experience that a lot of people might feel of like they either draw an X or when they're scratching, or like some people will like slap at their little welts. It's been documented that pain can actually inhibit the itch response. And a way that's thought of is there's something called population coding, where you essentially have a pathway of pain and a pathway of itch, and they're sort of talking to each other and communicating. And at some point, the painful information will overwhelm the itch information, and so then you perceive pain rather than itch instead.
Okay. I mean,
So that's Oh, go for it.
Yeah, I guess that
Yeah.
makes sense. I'm thinking of it kind of in terms of flavors that like you can have if you add a whole bunch of one spice to a dish, eventually you'll be like, oh, this dish only has basil, and you won't notice the
Yeah.
tarragon or something like that. Um,
Yeah. That's a good analogy to think of it.
That's really cool. Okay. So I want to get to, I'm just gonna like bogart this entire thing. I have all the questions, but we did get a ton of good questions on Instagram and on Twitter. We've got a bunch coming in through the chat, which is great. So let's switch over to that. Okay.
Sure.
Wow. Okay. Um, okay. We're gonna talk. We're gonna go to the one that everyone asked and that we already kind of chatted about at the start. Just like this idea of tickling.
Yeah.
And I think this does go to your point of like the brain understanding things, but you know, is tickling lumped into all this stuff? Can we just be like everything uncomfortable is the same?
That's a tempting idea, but especially the more that we learn about this stuff, unfortunately, I don't think we can
Okay.
lump something like tickling into these things. I personally don't know a whole lot about tickling, but in terms of like how I don't understand the whole pathway of something going from, someone gently touching like, your armpits or whatever to cause you to laugh. But uh, I mean, there are some similarities in that it is uncomfortable. So I personally don't know enough about tickling sensation to really say where exactly it fits in. I
Yeah.
would imagine it's kind of different, or probably pretty different from the sensation of pain and itch.
Yeah. No,
I
I
think a good idea is to say that it is a unique experience.
yeah.
So I think that things that are, like sound is a very unique thing, and pain is a very unique thing. Itch is a very unique thing.
Yeah.
It seems like tickling is too.
Yeah.
So it probably shares some stuff, but I would say it's probably pretty different. I just can't say exactly how.
Sure. Well, I mean a lot of this stuff has to do with context too, right? Like we've all there's I think most people who have been tickled, there's been times where it's funny and there's other times where it is
Yeah,
not funny.
or it's
Where
terrible.
it's
Yeah,
terrible, exactly. And pain is complex as well. Okay, we just wanted to get that one out of the way because everyone asked that one. Um,
yeah. Sorry to disappoint people.
oh, that's okay. So maybe somebody will study whatever tickling, and they can come on and make me even more uncomfortable. Okay. I love this question from Jaden. They asked, can you mind over matter itchiness or pain? Like, can you convince yourself that you just don't feel it?
Yeah, so the idea of pain tolerances is a very strange one because, as everyone sort of knows, we don't all have the same pain tolerance. What might really hurt for me might be, totally innocuous to somebody
Yeah.
else. Um, and the actual mechanism of how it's, I wouldn't say the word decide is correct, because I think that implies a lot of other things.
Mm.
But uh, it's pain itself is modulated by expectations of the experience, by previous history with the experience, what the actual painful stimulus is,
Yeah.
how long it's been going on for, so that all of those things come together to sort of shape one person's pain tolerance.
Huh.
And pain tolerances shift for people from day to day, or even probably hour by
Oh
hour,
yeah.
even sometimes, depending on what's going on. Uh, so, I mean, there is a sort of idea that you can sort of mind, like you can will your way out of a certain painful situation.
Yeah.
Uh, but it seems like it's not necessarily that the pain goes away, but rather that you're able to stay functional
Huh.
while experiencing it. In a lot of clinical pain medicine, for example, when someone has an intractable pain problem or like a chronic pain condition,
Hmm.
uh, most of the time there isn't a flat out cure for that problem, unfortunately, at
Hmm.
least not yet.
Hmm.
So what people will try to do is, or at least what clinicians will try to do, is think of like, how do I make this person functional in the way that they want to be? Like,
Mm.
how do I help them make sure they can get to work? And how do I make sure that they can spend time with their families without suffering through the experience?
Hmm.
Uh, Itching, on the other hand, I haven't really seen much about, and I think this owes to the fact that itch science has its own topic of investigation. I think it was only like 4 years ago that there was a journal specifically called Itch that Professor Karstens actually created
Huh.
with some people, was even started before everything was inside the pain field, and it's starting to become its own niche
Huh.
group. Um, so as far as I know, I mean, like, sort of like pain where you can say like, okay, it's not as painful as I thought. I think it is possible, at least in my own experience, that like, okay, I have various opinions about how itchy certain things are at certain times.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it does seem like itch typically is something that is very hard to just sort of ignore.
Yeah.
And that seems to be almost by design. I mean, it's not actually a reflex, but when you have a mosquito bite, it really sucks if you don't scratch it.
Oh yeah.
So,
Well, and I guess that it
and
kind of
that,
makes sense, right? Like if I'm literally scratching my head right now. Oh, it's because of this. I'm sorry to everyone watching who just scratched their head as well. But I mean, there is some benefit to it. Like we scratch because an itch could mean there's a bug on us, or an itch could mean, something is starting to poke into our skin. And it's also a good thing that we don't, if we have pain, just associate it as itch, right? Because let's say we had an open
yep,
wound, it sometimes when it heals, it makes us itchy. But if it was open and we're like, ow, this really hurts, and started scratching, that's not what you
yeah,
want. Um,
right. And that brings up the really important point that the what we actually do when we're experiencing pain versus experiencing itch are two very different kinds of behavior sets. If something's painful, you'll probably remove yourself from the painful stimulus.
yeah,
If something's itchy, you're going right to it and scratching like crazy at it sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
So
Huh.
uh, they're they're related. They somehow talk to each other and they're related, but they're not the same, and it's pretty strange
Yeah.
perceptually.
Huh, that's fascinating. I'm looking off to the side, and people are also starting to get what I'm getting, which we've got Jeff F saying, I appreciate the convo and education, but I'm the itchiest, most ticklish person ever, and I'm starting to bug out a little bit. And then Stephanie says, oh, why does
That's
talk
understandable.
yeah, why does talking about itching make me so itchy? It's like when you see a bug on someone else and ugh. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
let's see if we can find a question that will make people less uncomfortable. I mean, it is oh, perfect. This is not less uncomfortable. This will be a fun one. Rakesh says herpes has itching and pain too. I almost said I love herpes, but I kind of do, like from the microbiology standpoint. Herpes is one of the coolest sets of viruses. Anyway, as herpes has itching and pain, why? Is nerve impulse transmission impacted? Does this go back to that point, maybe, of like itch having the ability, that pathway taking in both inputs?
Yeah, that could be. So, like I mentioned before that there's the histaminergic pathway of itch. Uh, there's also non-histaminergic pathways of itch, and so I'm not super familiar with the physiology of what herpes is actually up to, but I'd imagine it does some immune responses that would induce histamine to pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think it kind of comes back to, and unfortunately, because I don't know enough about how herpes is influencing the skin, I think it comes back to the fact that, at least assuming we haven't proven population coding for itches the way it works, but assuming population coding is right, there's probably some low level amount of itchiness that's happening, and then eventually pain will take over as a result of the skin lesions that are arising from it.
Hmm, that's so interesting. Okay, cool. Somehow that question was less uncomfortable. All right, let's pop over and let's see what questions were coming in here. Um, so, wow. Okay, I don't know if you know this word. How does the allopatric itching work? Um, allopatric.
Allopatric.
I think that's the one that we're kind of been talking about, of like seeing it, kind of the sympathy itching. I will look it up at the same time, or I don't know if you're looking up. um,
I just tried to Google it
yeah, and to be fair, Jack says no idea if that's the right word. Probably not. Um,
because I'm seeing a lot of stuff about species diverging and things like that, which I remember learning about a little. But
yeah, okay, we're gonna have to look it up, and we're gonna have to like send a message to Jack and send it to the whole world. Because Jack has been chatting a lot, which is awesome. Okay, here's a fun one. We're having questions about phantom pain. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, like what's going on there? Action says when a part is removed, like the like other part of the body might take that part of the brain. Like you get these
Mhm.
weird things where if you like, what is our brain doing, and why are we in pain or having an itch when it's not even there?
Right. So that's a really interesting and fascinating, basically phenomenon.
Yeah.
So what will happen is, let's say I lose my hand here. What happens is, this isn't exactly right, but the idea of the whole, like neurons that fire together, wire together sort of idea,
Huh, that's like the cutest
where,
version of a bird of a what is it? Bird of a feather flock together. Anyway.
yeah, so and that's like a simpler way of describing a pretty complicated process, but uh, the brain will strengthen connections that are constantly firing together and weaken ones that aren't. And so what will happen is, if I lose my hand, the sensory cortex in my brain suddenly loses a lot of information that's being sent to it from what's not there anymore. And so other parts of me will start, other parts of my somatosensory cortex will start taking over the parts that are no longer used, kind of. So uh, what happens is, and it's not entirely sure why it presents as pain in terms of your perception, but it's thought, at least in my understanding, that it's essentially this confused wiring of sensation that the brain is being forced to interpret. And so people will describe like, oh, my hand is like very stuck in this like closed fist, or it's in this almost impossible position. And it's thought that it's because the brain, without having the information of what your hand's actually doing, is basically there's a miswiring,
Yeah.
and it's perceiving things that it interprets as pain because it's confusing or something like that. I don't think we have that great of an understanding of what specifically is happening there, but something that's interesting, and something that people may have heard about before, uh, with a scientist named Ramachandran, he came up with a very simple idea for neuropathic pain patients where, or sorry, phantom limb pain patients, where let's say the patient says, oh, my hand is stuck in a really tight fist and it really hurts.
Mm-hmm.
What he did was he had a box with a mirror in it that the person could see inside the box, and it would create a reflection of the hand that they didn't have anymore
Mm-hmm.
using the hand that they did have. So they'd put their good hand into the box,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd have a reflection that sort of looks like their, the missing hand. And what he had people do was, he said, try to get your good hand into the same position as what you feel like your other hand is in. So if they said it was in a painful fist, he said, put your good hand into that position as best you can, and then try to release it and watch it happen in this little box.
Mm.
And so patients would do that, and it actually worked for some reason. So by recreating that sort of visual expectation of what my body was doing with that fist example,
Yeah.
just by releasing it in the box, it turns out that they could basically fix neuropathic pain,
Huh.
or sorry, phantom. I don't know why I keep saying it is neuropathic, I guess, but not the same way. Uh,
I love talking with
yeah,
experts because
they
people
could fix that.
people correct themselves. I'm like, oh, I can't believe I said that. I'm like, I don't know what either of those words mean, so it's fine. No, that's great. And actually, we sort of stumbled on accident across Jack's question, which was he figured out, or they figured out, I'm not sure about pronouns, referred itch. And so that was the idea of stimulus applied in one region of the body as well as an itch or irritation of different part of the body. So it's just our brains are wild. And I've never actually thought about why. I mean, we've talked a lot before because we worked together on different stuff. You did itch and pain for a long time, and now you're working in like MRI and imaging things. And I truly never got the connection between that. I kind of figured you were just like, all right, peace out, itch and pain. I'm going to go do some other stuff. But there is
Oh,
kind of some centralized themes going on.
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, as much as perception is mediated through stuff that's happening externally, hitting your periphery, and then heading into your brain. Um, but there's all kinds of central processes that are happening at the spinal cord level and in your brain that are manipulating and filtering out all kinds of information literally constantly.
Yeah.
And that's part of the magic of how perception kind of works, at least for me.
Yeah.
That's part. So like the one concept that can happen in people with like chronic pain or chronic itch conditions like atopic dermatitis or eczema, psoriasis, things of those nature, is that they can have peripheral sensitization or they can have central sensitization. And so that basically means that the periphery, which is stuff like your skin outside, the periphery can get hypersensitive to things, or the response inside your spinal cord that's transmitting information to your brain can also get hypersensitive. So just a small stimulus can elicit a really big response in the spinal cord, and that makes you perceive this really severe experience.
Wow.
So it's, I mean, just like, everything is connected with neuroscience, and I guess everything's connected with the body in general. But you can have all kinds of these central processes mitigating what you're really experiencing and feeling, regardless of what's actually what's really happening to you, or really happening to you.
Yeah.
And I haven't said goodbye to itch and pain. I'm really hoping to go to a program that is working on itch and pain. But in the meantime, I've started working in imaging labs and stuff, and it's just it's been a really great thing to do before applying for schools and stuff.
That's awesome. Okay, I want to get to these two more questions because Fatih, I'm so sorry, and phonetical, which is actually incredibly ironic with that combination. Fatih says, after building up pain tolerance, can we lose it over time? And then phonetical followed up with, sometimes things hurt, only sometimes. Why don't we have like a pain memory, but we have an emotional memory? So let's go to Fatih's first. Of can we lose this pain tolerance? You kind of mentioned that emotions matter at the different hours.
I think that if you're experiencing something like, I think maybe like exercise might be a good example. So if you haven't exercised in a long time, and I'm guilty of that, then
yeah, what's up?
When you work out and then you're feeling like unbelievably sore, that's not only because I think that you've done a lot of work to your body and that's causing a lot of discomfort. I think it's also probably because, like, hey, you haven't experienced this in a long time. Yeah. But if you're working out all the time and you get sort of used to the aches and pains of exercise, it doesn't have as much of an effect on you. So I think that can happen with basically anything. If you were to, so like people with chronic pain conditions where they're having low back pain and something that they deal with all the time, I'd imagine if they were to be cured and then all of a sudden have that pain start up again, if that was possible, that it'd probably be more severe when it started back up again. I think that happens with injuries as well, like different joint injuries or things like that. I think that you might remember how things feel in general, but if you're experiencing a certain kind of pain constantly, that it just doesn't affect you as much. And so if it goes away for a while and then all of a sudden it's back, it might just, you probably remember really fast about what it really feels like, but if you're not experiencing it that much, you might actually have that kind of forgetting of or that lowered pain tolerance to that specific stimulus because you're just not experiencing it as much.
Yeah. Well, and I've certainly heard, theories about that if we remembered pain too acutely, there's a lot of things we would never do again. So it's sort of a mercy. And
True.
There's so many questions that we didn't get a chance to do. So I want to ask your contact information is down below, the Nociceptor, which I hope people have caught on how awesome that name is, the like pain reception stuff. And then you also have science_is_hard, at least on Instagram. Are you comfortable with people reaching out and asking some of these questions that we didn't get to?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be awesome. I'm always happy to talk to people about this stuff. So
Yeah, it's true. You
I'll do my
totally
best
are.
to answer questions.
Awesome. Okay, well, Jeremy, thank you so much. I hope that you are enjoying some parts of your interesting quarantine working remotely. This was awesome. Thank you for taking
Thank
the time.
you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's see. Switch back over. And thank you to everyone who came in and kept this conversation going. It's absolutely the most fun part. It feels like we're all sort of hanging out at an open seminar where we can keep talking. Um, Please go ahead, like, subscribe to the channel. Basically, what that does is it tells me, hey, keep doing this. It's worth my time. Meaning it's worth your time. I'm having a good time. I would have these conversations anyway. Let me know if there's somebody that I need to talk to, especially if it's you in terms of your cool science. I think this is the main way that I learn science facts right now. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out through whatever connection space. And yeah, keep asking some really cool science questions. Thank you so much. And it won't end, so I have to do it.